Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's professional development webinar from AGU called Defining Balance in Your Research, Studies, and Life, featuring guest speaker Eileen O'Grady. I'm Eric Hankin, the Centennial Executive Program Manager at AGU, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So I just want to start off with some housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation today, just type them into the chat box in the right side control panel, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. We're going to end up with about 20 minutes for Q&A, so we should be able to answer plenty of questions. Additionally, Eileen's going to ask you to reply to some poll questions and raise your hand and stuff like that today to keep you engaged. When we kick off a poll question, you'll see a pop-up screen, and then you'll get to answer the question by clicking on your answer. And finally, we always get this question. We are recording the webinar, and we'll send out a link to all webinar attendees in a follow-up email in a few days. And you can always view this webinar recording and sign up for new webinars, view other previously recorded webinars, including Eileen's presentation she did back in August, by visiting webinars.agu.org. Presenting today is Eileen O'Grady. Eileen is a certified nurse practitioner and wellness coach who uses an evidence-based approach with people to reverse or entirely prevent disease. She believes deeply that more attention must be paid to getting us unstuck from lifestyles that do not support wellness. Dr. O'Grady holds a doctorate in nursing and health policy from George Mason University in Virginia and has authored numerous articles and chapters on primary care, orthopedics, and health policy. Today, Eileen will teach us the key elements of positive psychology, emotional intelligence, what to say yes and no to, why your friends matter, and how to cultivate bedrock behaviors. And with that, I'll pass the mic over to Eileen. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about building some self-awareness around stress triggers and spend a lot of time on boundary setting. And I'm imagining that everyone on this call has some work to do on setting boundaries, erecting them, and then keeping them up. And then exploring this positive psychology strategies and this remarkable science that we need to be using across all disciplines. So I always like to start with my story. Eric just read my professional bio, but it has a lot to do with my own crash and burn. You know, being a doctoral student at the time, I was a parent to a baby and found myself seeing patients every 15 minutes as a nurse practitioner, and found I wasn't following any of my own instructions or advice. I was, eating terribly, not exercising, really stressed out, and drinking too much, and really had a terrible lifestyle. And so about a decade ago, I really rebuilt my life and started to slowly, ever so slowly, change my life and became a life coach so I could help patients actually get off of medicine instead of prescribing it. Because what really makes us sick is what we're doing in between office visits. It's not what anything that anyone can do in the healthcare system for the most part when we look at what is really killing America and causing early morbidity and mortality. It's this chronic illness epidemic, obesity, being sedentary, and certainly diabetes, sort of how we live our lives. So I have devoted my life to this process of intentional change. And what is it that we can say to people to help them move towards a high-level wellness and live a much better life than they are? So I've seen the ravages of a neglected life, of a stressed-out, high-stress, high-strung life, and what that does. And I don't want to see you in an ICU. That I'd much rather have you exposed to a very smart nurse practitioner way upstream while you're still healthy. So I think this is really a picture of what we're all feeling, no matter what industry you're in, and we're describing it as this VUCA world, VACU world, where it's volatile, ambiguous, complex, and uncertain. And you can imagine it's not just in your field, but it's across everything. There's lots of disruption. There is always the request to do more with less, no matter what industry you're in. The technology disruptors are certainly there and alive in every field I can think of, including, imagine owning a taxi company or a van service, that we're living a generation longer, that, since 150 years ago, we're living so much longer than we were, and we don't have systems in place to deal with these really long marriages and people that are living in their 80s, 90s, and 100s, and what that does for families and resources. And then we have these behavioral issues that I call the 3 Ds, but they're really many things. Dysfunctional, people, depressed, delusional, just damn difficult people that we have in our life that seems to be more noticeable with this ramped up stress, whether they're colleagues or family members or neighbors. There just seems to be, we're noticing it in healthcare, just more behavioral. People aren't just coming in with one discrete illness, but they've got that illness and they've got, an addiction or some other dysfunctional behavior going on that makes it so much more complicated in our world. And we have a fair amount of toxicity all around us. And then we also see unengaged people that are really checked out. And some people see that in the younger generation, or really entitled people. And that might be with faculty, students, or just people in general in your life, that you're noticing that there's more of a degree of that unengaged, or the opposite of being entitled. And then we have this, highly divided country, which we will not spend any time on, but there's an environment that we're all in and feeling, and it's very, very real and has effects on our body and our physiology. So I often think that to attain knowledge, we have to add things every day, and to attain wisdom, we have to remove things every day. So we're now in this knowledge economy that it's so easy. We can ask Siri to do anything, anytime we need anything, we can just look it up. We're having conversations with people, and we just look up these obscure facts, and we have instant answers. So we have all this knowledge, but sometimes we see very little wisdom. And I really believe that having a really beautiful life and living in a more balanced way requires an editing process. It's taking things away. And that's what we learn from designers. It's removing things. It's what makes things work better. So this is just some interesting science around feeling threatened versus feeling challenged. So we all want a challenge. And when we're feeling challenged, it's when the demand put upon us equals the resources we have. We have this interesting problem, and we've got all the resources to fix it and to look at it in time and expertise, and we have this attitude, well, let's fix this. It's like, let's get this done. And we're able to focus on other people. And when we're in this challenge state, we're much more focused on those around us and the team functioning, and we're much more logical. We're trying to problem solve because we're not in that really highly threatened state, which is when the resources exceed the demand, or less than the demand. And that our brain, when we're in this threatened state, slows down, we become less accurate, it narrows our field of attention, and we're much more distractible, and we just make bad decisions. We sort of tank on the decision-making capacity. So we might want to be thinking about our own mindset when we're going about our life. Are we spending a lot of it in threat? And what could we do, or what could we edit out or add to move back into where we're in this challenge space, where we're in a much more high-functioning place? So some of you might be feeling what's called a sociology term called role strain, and almost, many of us have it. I want to ask you the question if you feel that you might have this. It's this emotional conflict from competing demands made on a person to fulfill multiple roles. So a really good example is, being a parent and being a worker. These two roles are often, there's a tension between them, and it can escalate very quickly to a role conflict if we're not mindful. And this is when we have completely incompatible roles. So, for example, if you have to fire an employee who happens to be your best friend, or if you're a teenager and you become pregnant, those are incompatible roles oftentimes. So the thing about role strain is that there are societal norms that often put us in these roles, and we feel that they're very inflexible. And so we don't often feel that there's a lot of autonomy or flexibility in those roles. So I'd like to ask you to think about your own life, whether you're a mother or a daughter, a sister, a sibling, to raise your hand in the chat box if you have some version of role strain, if you're feeling these tensions kind of rubbing up against each other and causing you stress.
Okay, we're getting some people raising their hands. I see. We have about half dozen folks so far raising their hands.
Okay.
So, yeah, definitely some people who are experiencing role strain. Okay,
so more than half of you. And so if you feel that you don't have role strain, yay, we want to learn from you, what that's about. So it's sometimes I find it very comforting to have a language for what I might be feeling, because I remember, having these little kids and working on a dissertation and standing in the kitchen and saying, I'm having role strain. Just giving it a name can be very comforting, and can help us through things. So here's a sign that we might be neglecting the self. So you're going about your life You might be in graduate school, you might be an employee, you've got maybe aging parents, maybe you've got little kids, you've got a lot going on. And so the first thing that we often neglect is the self. And so one of the things that we do when we're neglecting the self is we reach for things outside of ourselves to feel better. So if you think about a little baby, the first thing they learn is to self-soothe, is to put themselves to bed without anything intervening, maybe a pacifier, but it's mostly an internal process. And so what happens as we get older, we just start to reach for things: food, alcohol, drugs, porn, house porn, where you're looking at home and garden television, whatever it is, where you're sort of checking out, you're blotting your feelings. And the problem with this is when we neglect the self like this, is that we're actually making the original emotion worse. We're not meeting it. So if this person is lonely, for example, this pie is not going to make that loneliness go away. So we often reach for things that are taking us in the opposite direction of where we want to go. So just be thinking about your own default. What happens when you start to go into overload or overwhelm? What are you turning to for comfort? And I think it's important to have this quick conversation about the difference between selfishness and self-care, because we often conflate these two ideas. And I want to really rip them apart, pull them apart, because they're entirely separate things. So a selfish person takes things from other people, they splash on other people, they don't care what other people think. And really selfish people often don't make it into the workplace. They often end up in prison. They never kind of move past that very childish idea that I want it and I want it now. And as we move through adolescence in our early 20s, we start to become much more other-focused, peer-focused. We want their approval. And then as self-care, somebody who quietly takes care of themselves, brings healthy food, leaves at 6 o'clock to go to spin class, whatever it is, but they're not splashing on and affecting other people. And we have to pull these two things apart, and they're entirely different concepts. And so Deci and Ryan came up with this idea that each human person has three basic human needs that when they go unmet, things go sideways. So the first one is competence, that we often need to feel that we're effective in our environment, that we're good at what we do, that we have the skills. The second is autonomy, the need to control the course of our lives. And this is the one that I think gets short shrift. And this is the one that I think goes unmet oftentimes, that you might be in a dissertation experience or a workplace where you're being micromanaged and you feel suffocated, like someone's standing on your neck, that you don't have the decision making capacity or the authority to make decisions. So the worst place to be in is in a situation which many people find, like when they're taking care of their elderly relatives or parents, they have all of the responsibility and none of the authority, which is a terrible place to be. So you're carrying this burden around that you have no control over. So I think this autonomy, whenever we can give it, if we have people or children that are kind of reporting to us or we're raising, whenever we can give people autonomy as much as possible, that's a hugely important idea. Because I know there was a psychologist that told his child that he just wanted the yard to be green and clean. And that was his only charge, is you take care of the yard. And the kid ended up really liking having a paper route. So he hired a friend to cut the grass. And the parent here didn't really care how it got done as long as it got done. And if more of us had that autonomy, we would have a higher degree of well-being. And then relatedness, this idea that our relationships in our life are generally positive and they're close. But I bring this up to really point out this need for autonomy and looking at the course of your life, and do you have enough of it? And you need to ask for it if you don't. So most of this talk is evidence-based, but because I'm Irish, I want to bring in this poet, David White, who wrote this book on the three marriages. And he contends that each human life has three marriages, whether we want to admit it or not. And the first one is the marriage to the self. And this is the one we neglect the most. And this marriage is the one where if our 16-year-old self, and this is a really big question that helped me change the course of my life when I was tanking, is I asked myself, if my 16-year-old self met me walking down the street, would he or she be proud of who I've become? And that question really sent shivers down my spine, because I was off course. I was not living the life that I had dreamed of, and I had to get in right relationship with that teenager. And then we have our significant other, and that could be someone you haven't met yet. My aunt was a nun, and she married God. She had a beautiful relationship, her whole, for 50 years. And sometimes if your significant others don't feel significant, you might be neglecting them. And then we have our work. And for some reason in this culture, our work seems to eclipse everything. It just, or work or school or whatever it is, it eclipses these other two. And when you neglect one marriage, you neglect all three. So the punchline for this talk is, sort of finding balance, is that there is no balance. I mean, I don't really believe in balance because it feels like someone else is imposing it on you. So if you want to spend 8 hours in the garden, I mean, have at it. Lots of people get nourished by that, but we all have these different things that nourish us. So I think, to me, the way we balance our lives is that we're in choice. Again, we have some autonomy and decision about how we spend our time, and we're much more intentional and thoughtful about how we do that. So if you have this situation where your work is eclipsing certainly the self and the significant other, you might need to do some modification here and not let this work totally define you. And ask your significant other, if you have one, or others, children, whoever they are, do they feel significant in your life? It's a great question. So that's just one way to kind of frame and think about balance, these three marriages, and are they talking to each other? And then we have some more of the evidence about Dan Buttner, who was one of these extreme athletes. He traveled all over the world doing these crazy, 100-mile runs, and he rode his bike from Alaska to Argentina. And he noticed, going all over the world, that there were these blue zones, he called them, where people that are living into their hundreds, and they're living well. So they're not in a nursing home, they're not incontinent and demented, but they're actually a big part of the community, living to 105. And so he studied these communities all over the world, Loma Linda, California, and Iceland and Guatemala and India and all over, and found that they all do these 9 things. And these are 9 things that we all learned in kindergarten but often don't do. So that, if 105-year-olds don't have exercise clothes that are different from what they wear every day, because they have ambient exercise, they're just moving throughout the day. These men in Italy hike the mountains to look for mushrooms, 6 miles doing hilly walks. It's sort of built into their life. They just walk, they keep a garden, and not for the vegetables they grow, but they're doing range of motion, they're bending down. The women in Okinawa, the longest lived women on the planet, squat down to eat. And they say this 80% rule. It's sort of like, don't eat the whole chimichanga. They have this expression, it says something loosely translated, don't eat till you're past full. So stop when you're 80% full. And people that live to 105 downshift, so they have different speeds throughout the day. It's not just stop and collapse and then go. And then they eat lots of plants. They have locally harvested wine, so these are not Jello shots and tiny amounts. They belonging to a church or a meditation group, you live 14 years longer. And then they have this supportive circle of friends. So they don't just have this one besieged daughter. They have a whole range of people that are in their life, acquaintances all the way up to intimacy. And that's absolutely something we can be cultivating now. And then this is the big kahuna of well-being theory, and this has a huge solid evidence base and legs on this. And it's from Martin Seligman, who thought, as president of the American Psychological Association, why are we looking at all the way the human person breaks down spiritually, physically, emotionally? We have everything coded in this DSM category where, if you have anorexia nervosa, you have to have 5 of these 10 symptoms. We break everything down, 36,000 ways we break down. And he was wondering, what about those people that have awesome lives? What are they doing? And so this is the PERMA model. This came up, this is this theory of positive psychology, that we can actually practice these principles, like the first one being positive emotions. Do we have positive emotions, 3 to 1, feelings in our body, not positive thoughts, but our body feels good, that we're letting it land and we're savoring it. So do we have a positive emotional landscape that's 3 to 1 to negative? And the 1 negative is important, so you're not in a mental hospital. And then we have engagement. Like, these are flow activities when we're totally absorbed, we're not bored, we're not stressed, we're just in a really, really comfortable, absorbed place, and we lose track of time. This is a way of filling up our cup, and we're learning a lot about flow. It builds resilience, so when things get hard, the slings and arrows come, we have some resilience baked in. Relationships with others. People matter. And are your relationships generally 3 to 1 more positive than negative? And if not, do you need to do some editing? Meaning and purpose, making sure that you're feeling like you're working on something important, that you're living, what your why is, why you get up in the morning, and are you living that? Is that coming through in your life? And then finally, at the end of the day, do you feel that you're good at what you do, that over time you get better and better at what you do and you achieve some mastery? So this idea that being good at what you do is very helpful to leading to well-being. So this is not feeling happy so much in that smiley face. This is actually the really deep dimensions. So I want to ask you to look at this model and ask yourself, and we're going to start a poll here, which area of well-being could use more of your attention? Is it feeling more positive emotions, engagement? Is it relationships? Is it meaning and purpose? Or is it achieving your most important goals? So let's take 10 seconds and do that.
Okay, so we're going to launch our first poll. Let's bring that up. Okay, so as Eileen stated, which area of well-being requires more of your attention? Feeling positive emotions, more negative, engagement, relationships that are mostly positive, having meaning and purpose, or achieving your most important goals. We'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm closing the poll, and now let's look at the results. Can you see them, Eileen?
Barely. So
okay, I'll read them off.
No,
so,
I can't.
Yeah, the audience can see.
Just give me the first 2%.
Are saying positive emotion.
2.
Yeah, and then the other top 2 are relationships and engagement.
Okay,
so
great.
Positive
so that's
emotions, relationships, engagement.
Yeah. So a lot of that is, if wanting to feel positive emotions, is when something positive happens, what we often do is we dismiss it and say, "Oh no, it was nothing. You've had some kind of a win." And we don't let it land even. So this idea of savoring and letting it land and celebrating these wins, pausing, and then pursuing things and being around. So these are all very much related and linked, and making sure you're spending time with those friends that bring out your best, and making sure, months don't go by that you don't see your favorite people. So good to know. And there's some very specific things that you can do to build that. Okay, so we're moving into some boundary setting to think about balance. And so the Nobel winners in 2013 in physiology won because they discovered that the intelligence of the cell is actually in the membrane, and we always thought the nucleus was kind of driving everything. But they discovered there's an intelligence in the membrane, and that the membrane is actually in charge of what it lets into the cell, what it lets out of the cell, and what it docks to. And why this is important is because I think it absolutely applies to the human condition, that when we take full charge of what we let in, people, food, drinks, screen time, and really pay attention to what we're letting in, what we're letting out, our energy, our words, our tone, and then what we're attaching to. What are we paying attention to? What are we getting worked up about? What are we allowing to outrage us? When we pay attention to that and shore up that cell membrane and tighten that, amazing things happen, because it's really the only 3 things we have control over in our life is what we let into it, what we let out of ourselves, and what we attach to, and that's it. And so a laser beam focusing on that is hugely important. It helps us stay in our lane. So sometimes you might have, I can remember working on my dissertation, and I would be looking for conflicts to get myself involved in. Like other people's problems can be easier to focus on. They're distractions because we don't want to face what we have to face, or some hard chapter we have to write, or we're stuck in some area, so we start looking for things. So this cell membrane metaphor helps us stay in our lane and what we're in charge of. And having a great life and living in balance absolutely requires us to edit out the Cruellas of our lives, the people that drain us, the frenemies, the people that really don't have our back, where we feel diminished after we're with them. We don't have to even name it or articulate it. If we feel diminished around certain people, we can set some invisible boundaries, which I think it really helped me in my younger life. So you have this is a suburban metaphor. You have your across the street friends, and these are people, as you're talking and they're talking, you can say to yourself, yeah, across the street friend, you're not even coming in my driveway. Then you have your driveway friend, you can come out and speak to them. Your front door friends, they knock, and then a much, much smaller group are back door walk-in friends. And so I used to have a life where I let everybody in the back door, and I was filled with anger and resentment and, no boundaries whatsoever, until I learned this model that as someone's talking to me, I don't like what they're saying or doing, I'm saying to myself, across the street friend, like they're not coming in, and I'm allowed to decide that. So I think, my criteria now as an adult is anyone outside in a robe qualifies as your across the street friend. You don't have to invite this guy in your driveway. And so a lot of what we get stuck on is that we're feeling guilty about the past. and we're worrying about the future, sort of catastrophizing. And a lot of the work that I know you're reading about mindfulness is sort of being in the moment being here now. And when we start to amp up, or anxiety starts to ratchet up, or we have a setback, it's so easy to go back to the past and be filled with regret about how it went, or worrying about the future. So much suffering can be alleviated when we just stay right here in the moment and stay in the facts. Because there is a metaphor that if you've got one foot on the past and one in the future, you're peeing all over the day. So you really want to stay in the present, stay here now, particularly when you're in a rough spot or you're having a setback, and not go into these other places. So another way to think about balance is to deploy the hell yes criteria, which means you get an invitation, you're really good at what you do, somebody wants you to join a committee at the university you're at, and unless it's a hell yes, it's a no. So what happens to us is we're good at stuff, and so people may want a piece of us, right? And then we say yes, or we say maybe, and they beat us down, and then we regret it. And as it gets closer and closer, we're feeling more and more resentful and put out, and we don't want to do it. So to me, we have to be saying no in a 3-to-1 ratio so that we get to our yes. So many of you are doing important work, graduate work, and that's your yes. And so all these other peripheral things that don't take you where you want to go are a no. So we really get into trouble when we're not saying no to the things that we don't want to be doing, so that when we are doing things we want to do, we're all in and we're fully present and there. So that has helped me a lot. And even the maybe people can chew away at it. And so it's just a polite no right from the get-go. Another way to think about this is, in my own life, when I was practicing in that way, writing fistfuls of prescriptions for people with chronic illnesses, that I was just in need of a repot. I was in a root ball. I had no place to grow. I had no soil or light, growth, sunlight, anything. I couldn't grow. And so I have repotted myself several times, and sometimes it doesn't even require a new job. It's just a new attitude. I was writing a monthly column for a journal, and I hated doing it. Every month I dreaded it, and I realized, they didn't give me any parameters at all. I just put them on myself, that it had to be this boring, dry thing. So I started to write more personally and more edgier and snappier titles, and share more of myself, and take a story from my life and apply it to the column, and it just became alive for me, and that was a repot without me even moving. So it was just a change of mindset. So that's another way to think about, are you in a place that's confining you? It's like painful if you have a shoe that's too small, it hurts. So to be thinking about, what can you do to repot? And one of the things that we know from the work of Adam Grant, who's a youngest tenured professor at Wharton's MBA program, does this research on people that are really that are very generous and givers at work. And what happens is, people that give a lot often don't ask for help. And he found that when givers don't ask for help, they tend to sort of stay at the bottom of the workforce. But when generous people that are very giving ask for help, it creates a cascade of goodwill. And so, people are very hesitant to ask for help. And I notice, I get 3 or 4 calls a week from, nurses and graduate students that want to do what I'm doing. And they'll say, Eileen, I just want to pick your brain, and I wondered if I can meet you for coffee or get on the phone with you. And I'm always really delighted to do that. Everyone loves to get their brain picked, right? So we need to be doing more of that, and especially going to these loose acquaintances, not people that that give you redundant advice, but going to people that a college roommate or somebody that maybe isn't so close to us, and laying out the problem and just getting sort of fresh advice and asking for help more is a really great tool for anyone in graduate school or anyone in life. And then we have this inner critic, and if we can corral that, and that's our inner voice that every single person on the planet has, that says, you're not enough, you're not good enough, smart enough, competent enough, whatever it is, you are not enough. And so the main thing about an inner critic is, we don't want it driving the bus. We want it kind of duct taped and stuffed in the trunk. Like, we don't want this to run our lives. So this voice, you will notice, will get much louder and louder as we start to do braver things. And it's our job to acknowledge it. That's the main thing with an inner critic, to say, oh, no, we're not having this conversation, and shut it down. And change the conversation, because that can really stop us in our tracks when we have this really negative self-talk. And then really what we're looking for, I think, in this world is, if we think about this complex problem, Times Square, was a great example of that, where They had this terrible traffic problem, pedestrian accidents all over the place. They closed streets, they made them one way, they did everything. And then one day, this city planner who has this wonderful TED Talk came and just looked at the space and thought, what can we do? This is such a problem. What can we do to fix this Times Square mess? The traffic was snarled and people were dying regularly, getting hit by trucks and buses. So this planner realized people didn't have a place to sit. So they invested $3,000 in these bistro chairs, and voila, like it became this landmark, one of the most sought after destinations in the world. This really simple solution. So I think what we're being asked to do in this vacuum world is this volatile, ambiguous world is to think differently. You know, it's not more, it's a completely different shift. And these bistro tables have brought in like flagship stores and so much commerce and fixed the problem once and for all. Made it a #1 tourist destination. And this is a cancer hospital. You know, when you do these simple, inexpensive things, it elevates everybody, the patients and the workers. And then there was a woman that was she had a failing jewelry company in Detroit, and she heard Cory Booker, who was then at the mayor of Newark, talking about his guns. This has relevance to your health. Talking about guns for money program, and any thug in Newark could bring their gun in, no questions asked, and get money for it. And the program was so successful, the crime rate went down. The program ran out of money, and they had no place to store the guns. This jeweler gets in the car, drives to Newark, meets with Cory Booker, and says, I would like to buy your guns. And so she started this new company called Caliber Jewelry. And she melts the guns down, and each piece of jewelry, she makes belt buckles and all kinds of things, has the serial number of the gun and where it was, and all of that. And she's making $6 million a year. So it's this idea where there's nothing really new. It's combining really liberally new things, you know, that things that don't really belong together, and that's what we're really being asked to do. And changing the sea of sameness, like what can we do to make things more novel? This is a beautiful airline in South Africa, just making things really fun when we're in this sea of gray, you know, when we're on the airplanes and they're all so indistinguishable. What can we do to be more innovative, to think about balance in that way? So my hope for you is that you create a life that does not need escaping from, that you are not living a life where you feel like you have to do Thelma and Louise and drive off the cliff, or, you know, go home and drink a quart of liquor, or escape from your life, that you want to be creating a life that you don't want to run away from. And that really starts now. And I do want to go over some hacks for you, balance hacks, but I'd like to for you to answer in the chat box, as a result of this conversation we're having today, what would you like to do differently as a result of these ideas I'm bringing to you?
Okay, so just if you want, you can type your answer into the chat box over in your control panel, and we'll see them. We'll read some off. We won't show your name. Don't worry. We'll keep it confidential.
It's anonymous? Okay.
Yeah.
And also, as you're writing and thinking, be thinking about some questions you might have or ideas.
Okay, and while we wait for some folks to answer, I was wondering if you could answer this question. Eileen, you've spoken some about autonomy. How can people create more autonomy?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with asking for it. So if you're negotiating a job, you know, whatever that is, or negotiating anything, I think it just starts with the ask. You know, that if you're going to be given a project, you want to define exactly how you're going to be managed. So a lot of times we have this faux collaboration where people say, oh, yeah, we want you to decide that, and then they reverse what you've done. So that's not really autonomy. So I think calling that out, and when you're negotiating any kind of project or job or anything in your life, even with your parents or family members, if you're making a decision and you're given the authority to make the decision, you're making sure it's not going to be reversed, and asking for more autonomy. I'd really like to take this project on and fly it alone if I could, and check in with you weekly or monthly. So I think it starts with asking for it. And getting it whenever you can.
Right. Awesome. So we have some good answers coming in. One person says they'd like to be more focused on a daily basis at work, so they can put in fewer hours, but in the long run be more productive.
Mm-hmm.
Another says utilize the hell yes approach, learning to say no to some of the requests that are come their way. Awesome. So I don't
Yeah,
know if you want
yeah.
to continue along or speak to some of those answers.
Yeah, so the no thing. So the way we learned how to say no is actually from the international relations people and diplomats, is that they never just say no. So it's the sandwich technique where you tuck your no in between two yeses. So for example, you might want to say, you know, right now I'm working on my dissertation, and that is like the most important thing to me to get that thing done and off my neck. So that's your yes. Like, you tell them what your yes is. I'm working on my dissertation, so therefore, you know, I can't join the PTA. I can't chair that meeting for you. So there's your no. And then you end it with, but I'm honored that you asked, or maybe I can find someone, or maybe later. So you end it on a positive also. So you tuck your no between two yeses, so they don't come back in and start challenging you. So if they know your yes, they're much more likely to accept your no. And around, you know, the work thing too, I think that it's really important to get to work. And I just learned this through trial and error, fed and watered and exercised, so that, you know, we talk about bedrock behaviors. I think we covered that in the first seminar that I did with you all. And it has to do with, you know, there should be some things in your life that you're not negotiating, because they're like your self-worth. You don't want to be negotiating those. So, you know, screen time. I mean, I think everybody should have a tech policy. Movement, food, sleep, you know, everything's on a foundation of sleep. So when you get to work, you have already sort of taken care of, or after work, or whatever that is, it's baked into your life, and you're not negotiating. You're not saying, I don't feel like it. It's what we call, you've made it a habit. Like when you brush your teeth, when you're a child, your parents had to tell you to brush your teeth, and then they got to stop doing that because you don't even think about it now. And the same thing with bedrock behavior, so that you get to work and your tank is sort of full. And there are some companies that just, that you get paid to get the job done, and they don't care if you're there or not, or how often. So that's pretty progressive. So that's what I'd say to those, Eric. Is there anything else?
Yeah, we have one person says they would have set up one weekly telework day, probably to, you know, spend a little less time in the office, a little more time at home. Another says they'd like to define their goals better, their goals, not other people's. So understanding, you know, what they want to achieve.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's beautiful. Perfect. Okay. All right. So then I just want to remind you that I have this wellness pearl that sometimes it's just a few sentences to remind you of some of these concepts. I have documentaries, TED Talks that I've curated that I love, books on my webpage if you want to go there, and I post very carefully curated things on my Facebook page. I know there's a lot of junk out there, and that's not what I'm about. And then some balance hacks. And so there are some, I just want to touch on this screen time stuff and this technology that just seems to be consuming us. And as you all know, the developers of some of these programs have been very concerned, and they don't allow their children to use them because they're so addictive. And so they talk about, you know, what's time well spent, that we often don't know what's on the menu. So if we're walking down the street and looking at some Yelp review of where to go and get an after dinner drink, we might walk by a jazz band that's playing live in the park that's right next to us, and we don't even see it because we're looking at our screen, right? So what's not on the menu is a really great question. And I think it's so important to have a good life that you set boundaries early and often. And that has to do also with people speaking in a way that's unacceptable to you. We talked at the last seminar about, bullies and when people are acting inappropriate, even if they have a power gradient over you, we have got to establish boundaries that is not acceptable for you to talk to me that way, or not accepting unacceptable behavior. Pruning your people, deploying the hell yes criteria, and really making sleep a priority. I am reading a book right now by a PhD sleep expert, and it is really frightening to me how sleep in this country is a huge problem all over the place. And he talks about why when you are sleepy, when you're driving, is so much more dangerous than being drunk, because when you're drunk, you're delayed, and when you're sleepy, you're out when you fall asleep. So there's so much more fatal, and it affects every hormone and cell level in our body. Not having enough sleep, we overeat, we do all kinds of bad things. So that's, to me, is the most important bedrock behavior. Quieting the inner critic, making time in nature. That they've done all these studies where people don't exercise in a gym, and exercise in nature, and the two exercise groups do great, but the ones that exercise outside have a bigger bump in their well-being scores. So however you can, planet gaze, look at the stars, be outside, and absolutely have a tech policy. So I do a 24-hour a week. I unplug. Right now I'm in a news blackout where I'm not engaging in any of it, and I can't tell you, it's a heavenly experience at this point. It feels really great to have that in control of what comes in, and I do that periodically. I'm putting myself in my day, my bedrock behaviors. I went hiking early this morning. I've eaten a really good salad. So, I'm not saying I've got all this down and I'm perfect, but having those things in place where I'm not negotiating and arguing with myself. What am I going to eat? What am I going to do? It's already like built in. I just get up and do it. And then asking for help. So I think, that in order to have a good life where there's no gardener, there's no garden. This idea that if you want to cultivate a really great life in this crazy world that we're in, it's going to take pruning and work. So I would love to take any questions you might have.
Great. Yeah, we have about 20 minutes for questions, so plenty of time for questions. You can type them in the chat box and we'll get to them as they come in. A few to start off with, though, Eileen. It's great when someone realizes that things are out of balance, that they aren't spending enough time on themselves or with their family members because they're just overwhelmed with work. But it can be, how can they make that pivot? It's one thing to recognize, it's another thing to implement change. Are there any tricks to making the pivot?
Yeah, I mean, for me, and for most of the people I work with, I sit on a giant exercise ball with a headset, and I talk to people that are in overwhelm for the most part, under-resourced, university, faculty members, all kinds of people. And I think it often requires a pain point. And when you're younger, you can probably tolerate more pain. And I think that in order for people to really just say enough, there's usually a symptom is coming, or some big mistake happens, or you just, you fall into a depression, or you gain a lot of weight, or something terrible happens, and you're just feeling like this is not working. That's unfortunately the thing that is required to move people through a change cycle. And, for me, I mean, I had to really edit out people. I had to quit jobs. I mean, sometimes that's the solution, is that, no, you can't be a full-time doctoral student and work full-time and have a baby. Like that's just, whoever told you that was a good idea or is going to work isn't going to work, So I think sometimes like actually surrendering can be very helpful. And I just, I think editing, that we're often just doing too much, and that we use busy as a proxy for relevance, so that as long as we're busy, we feel like we're doing something important, but we may actually be procrastinating and doing nothing on our dissertation or our most important goal. One of the other things that I just did, I'm writing a book. I've written several textbooks, but this is a new book for me that's much more personal. And I hired an editor. She's the project manager on it. So I send her my drafts. She edits them and sends them back to me, and she's organizing it. So like sometimes just getting experts on it and throwing some money at it can really help us get our goals. If you're working on a dissertation and you're stuck in some way, maybe you hire somebody to help you move it along. So all these kinds of things can help, and having your own mini goals for the week, for the month, for the year.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Ellen asks if you have any examples of strategies to quiet the sometimes very loud inner critic.
Oh, yeah. So I have my own story. So I was working, and I was speaking a lot to the health community, physicians and nurse practitioner groups, and I realized I wanted to go and speak to normies, like people that weren't in healthcare. And so I decided I was going to create a talk, and it's a kind of an early version of this talk. I had like 10 elements for well-being or something. And I was working with a coach at the time, and I said, well, I'm just going to wait for an invitation. And she thought, well, why don't you just create the talk and invite friends over? So 3 months out, I picked a date. I invite my neighbors and 12 friends and neighbors over to my living room, and I make this beautiful meal. And I'm going to give them this talk on my, flat screen TV. I've got the slides going, and I was just going to see, am I making any sense? Is this interesting? Does this work? I was so unsure of myself. So as the day wore on, the day came, I had the presentation ready. I had the food, the dinner was going, and I could hear, it was actually my mother's voice who do you think you are? I was working myself up into so much anxiety, I almost canceled it. That's how it was crippling me, this voice. And I remembered, oh, that's my inner critic. That's, she's long gone, but I'm still having this conversation. I was totally unaware. It ambushed me. And then I became aware. Oh, there's that voice again. So I take a 5x7 picture of her, and I say, you're not invited to tonight. And I take it out and I put it in the front seat of my car, in the passenger seat. And I go back into the house. And as I stepped across the threshold into my house, I felt this immediate relief. Like it was gone, that inner critic. And I went forward with the evening, totally calm. And I knew that night I had something, like I knew, okay, I'm ready to start talking to people outside of healthcare. I have the language to do that now. And so, the next day my kids were saying, why is grandma's picture in the car? You do what you have to. So oftentimes finding a physical symbol, because it's so deep in our brain, it's so primal, it's so down there, whether it's like the Mucinex guy or a little scroll or it's something that reminds you of that voice, to just say, you're not going to talk to me that way, and then put it away. So it's often a physical gesture. So that's my inner critic story that helped me so much. Because that inner critic will stop you. It doesn't want you to do brave things, and you've got to corral it.
I imagine for a lot of the folks on this webinar, it'll be a photo of their thesis advisor.
Oh, so that was another thing. This is kind of a fun thing. So when I was doing my dissertation, it really did feel like that Groundhog Day, like every day was the same, and I was pregnant at the time. And so the first thing I'd do, fire up the computer, and I'd go right to the acknowledgments page, and that's how I started. And I would just rip my committee member to shreds, and just, in spite of this chair, she finished and blah, blah, blah. Like I wrote the most mean-spirited things, swear words, everything that I could think of, and got it all out in this vicious acknowledgement page. And then I'd start my work. And then by the end, I had a kind of a neutral one. It wasn't glowing, but I had, toned it down. But that exercise really helped me.
Did you come up with that on your own, or did someone recommend?
Yeah, I just started like, because I like to start with the front matter whenever I write a book. And so I was talking about my acknowledgement page. And so, I had my husband and I guess my baby had come by then. And then I thought, here, let's go on to the committee now and just rip them a new one, really. So it was very therapeutic.
That's really funny. I've never heard of that. I love that idea. You just need to make sure you don't accidentally send that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you spoke some to the hell yes criteria and the kind of the no sandwich. Is there a recommended ratio for how many times to say yes to every no? To make sure you're not saying
well,
yes.
it's 3 to 1, but there's some fuzzy problems with repeating the science, and I guess it really depends, because I'm actually doing something on Good Morning Washington in a few weeks on people pleasing, and so a lot of it sort of stems from this kind of, we want people to like us and we want approval, and a lot of it is like how you were raised. So if you had a fragile parent or an alcoholic parent, saying no was not kind of an option, and keeping the peace was probably much more important. So we take that into our adult lives. So I think there's a lot to looking at our own people pleasing, and it's difficult when you're you have such a power grid, and you have a committee, chairperson over you who's older and more experienced, and so you certainly have to work that relationship, and you're not an equal in that, but in some ways you are, because they're being paid. That you are the CEO, and they are being paid to see you through this process. And so I think it's learning how, we don't know how to say no, so we don't say it. And so I think separating out, when you get an invitation, do you want to do it? And really getting clear if it's a yes or no first. And then, okay, and then once you do that, then it's like, and now how do I say no? And I've gone and asked people advice, like this really mean dean wanted me to join her faculty, and I wanted no part of it, and I knew she would be horrible to me. And I went and sought out some wisdom from an older faculty member and said, how do I tell no to this woman? How do I say no to her so she hears me? And so I kind of threw my kids under the bus on that one and said I just couldn't because of my kids or whatever. I made up I basically lied because she was a very toxic person. But I think, learning how to say no graciously and often, and looking at your own approval-seeking behavior and what is that? Like, why are we so loyal to someone's approval? And one of the things I do, I carry around in my wallet is a sticky note with 5 people on it. And these are, I call them pre-approved approval list. And these are people, also on my computer here, I'm looking at it, that I have decided a priori ahead of time that I care about these 5 people's approval. And one of them isn't even alive. And so when I'm doing something that's difficult or brave or hard, I run it through that list and say, would these people approve of what I'm doing? And that's it. So it's a very confined group of people that I want approval from. It's not the whole world. So that might be a helpful tool.
Yeah, very helpful. We had a question about boundaries, both like physical and figurative. Like how, do you have any advice for how someone can go on vacation and not worry about their research or work and not feel like they need to check emails, or go home at night and not feel the pull of work or the worries of what has to be accomplished the next day? Like, is there a way to switch, to turn an off switch on one part of your brain and on the other?
Yeah. So Eric, how many emails does it take to ruin a vacation?
One.
Yeah, exactly.
One bad one, yeah.
Right. One. So I think we have got to do a much better job. So if you get to work fueled up, fed, watered, slept, rested, that you're much more likely to like put in a good day's work and feel really good about it. So I don't know. I'm kind of a gig worker now, I'm in the gig economy, so I'm not like at a water cooler in an office all day, but there's a lot of time. I visit a lot of offices. There's a lot of time wasting going on. And so, maybe the idea of giving it a good 4, 6, 8 hours, whatever you can do, and then feeling that's a good day because it's never going to be done. I often think of Lucy and Ethel in the candy factory, the candy's coming, they're eating it, they're stuffing it, it's never going to get done. So the idea that you determine your own success measure and what's a good day's work for you and what's enough. So again, that might be that inner critic with a whip in its hand saying, do more, do more. So I don't know how we can go through in this world without a tech policy. I mean, Zuckerberg's kids have a tech policy, right? So I think we just absolutely have to turn off. And, I've taught graduate students and been online teaching and all that, and I'm not available on the weekends. I'm not available in the evenings. I model that behavior so then they get out into the workplace. I have a life. I might be out, with my friends, and I don't want to, and even if I'm sitting at home, we have to turn it off because it's very addictive. It's luring us in. It's just like eating the cherry pie. It's not good for us. It's like junk food. It doesn't nourish us. So what screens are we putting before us, and how is it nourishing us? What are we spending our time on? I think that's just a really great question.
That's an awesome answer. I wonder how someone can help implement that if their advisor or their boss is someone who doesn't have those boundaries, who is sending emails at 10 o'clock at night on a weekday, or while they're on vacation.
So I think it's
feel this way.
Yeah. I'm sorry. What?
I was just saying. So while the boss may not feel that the employee needs to do this, the picture is that, oh, my boss is doing this, I need to also be sending, acting like my boss while I'm on vacation.
Right. So it might be a conversation. So like I need off time. I need downtime. I know that's not how you work. Sometimes you might have to leave. Like if this is the environment and the expectation and it's not really compatible with the good life, and when you're in a dissertation situation, everything is temporary. So there is that muscling through, like just getting through it. I remember there was a lot of just pushing. I think anyone working on a dissertation has a great degree of perseverance. I have this funny friend of mine who's in her 90s who came home one day and told her husband, I'm so stupid, I can't finish this PhD. I'm not smart enough, I can't do it. And he said to her, oh, honey, don't worry, lots of stupid people have PhDs, So there's like, there is that pushing through, and it is a measure of perseverance. But I had a boss like that too, just 4 a.m. There are companies out there that they turn their servers off from 7 p to 7 a. And you can send an email, but it won't be delivered until the next day. So that they want it's Volkswagen, I think, although that's probably not a model company, but they actively want their employees to go home and nourish and re-nourish. So I think it might be a conversation, but it's also modeling, letting them know that, I take the evenings off. I put in the good days, hard days work, and maybe being more productive and editing out some of the nonsense at work and being more productive while you're there. Or maybe you work, one night a week, or, whatever it is. But I think erecting those boundaries and being really clear on that is important. You'll just get eaten alive, and your boss won't be at your funeral.
That's true. That's really helpful. So with that, we don't have any more questions. I'll give it a couple, another minute in case anyone has any lingering questions that they haven't put in yet. I don't know if you have any parting words or advice that you didn't get a chance to touch on.
Yeah, no. I'm just worried. I was traveling recently, and everywhere I looked, everywhere I went, everyone was looking down at their phone. It's just interesting, and it feels different when people are reading books. Like when you go to Europe, people are on the trains and they're reading books, and so we do have this thing, and I feel myself getting pulled in. I mean, hear me on that. There was one night I was up and I was looking up something, on YouTube, and it was like 1 a.m, and I kept saying one more, and I found myself, I could not turn it off. It was terrible. So, I mean, I think some of these policies that, getting this stuff out of our bedrooms and, the blue light before bed and all of that, it's like eating junk food. It feels good in the moment, but afterwards it's a complete time suck. So just, raising the quality of everything that you're doing, the food you're eating, the people you're with, how you're moving your body, what you're doing with your free time is hugely important.
I actually just saw a report on that last week, and it was talking about how important it is for people to be bored, how much important thinking happens then. The boredom is super important. So
and Einstein,
is actually really good.
Einstein came up with his theory, being bored and, wondering something on a train. He didn't have a Facebook in front of him. And, that's why you have great ideas in the shower, because your cognitive brain is shut off and you're able to access that more intuitive, wiser place. So, meditation is I can't say enough about.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think those are good words to end with. So with that, it's been another awesome webinar. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Assuming you did, you can also view Eileen's August webinar that she did on becoming the CEO of your dissertation on the AGU webinars page, which is webinars.agu.org. We're going to send out a recording of today's webinar to all attendees and registrants. In that email that has the recording link, there's also links to Eileen's webpage. You can sign up for her alerts. I receive them. There's great little tidbits to read. It's something different than the usual work email, which is nice. Eileen, it's been awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me, Eric. Good luck, you guys. Bye.
Yeah. Bye, all.